The morning started like any other. The sun had just begun to rise over the quiet streets of Ridgewood. Residents were going about their usual routines, picking up coffee, heading to work, getting ready for the day ahead. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone thought they knew each other, where life rarely felt unpredictable. 16-year-old Jamal Grant was walking home from basketball practice, his backpack slung over one shoulder. His friends had left moments earlier, cutting through the park to get home faster. Jamal chose the longer route, one that passed through the neighborhoods he'd lived in his entire life. It was a walk he'd taken hundreds of times before, so familiar that he could have done it with his eyes closed. But that morning was different. A patrol car sat parked at the edge of the street. Inside, Officer John Hayes watched the boy through the windshield. It wasn't the first time Hayes had patrolled this part of town, but something about the teenager seemed to catch his attention. Maybe it was the hoodie Jamal was wearing, or the way he walked, none of it unusual, but enough to spark curiosity, or perhaps, suspicion. Jamal was oblivious to the officer's gaze, focused instead on the music playing through his headphones. He had a history quiz later that day and was already running through flashcards in his head. For him, it was just another walk. For Officer Hayes, it was something else entirely. At 7:42 a.m., Officer Hayes activated his lights and pulled alongside Jamal. The sound of the siren cut through the quiet morning air, startling the boy. Jamal stopped, turned, and pulled his headphones off. He didn't understand what he had done, but he stopped anyway. His parents had always told him to cooperate, no matter what. Officer Hayes approached with deliberate steps, his face unreadable. "Where are you headed?" he asked. Jamal hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden attention. He answered honestly, "Home." The officer's next question felt sharper. "What's in the bag?" Jamal glanced down at his backpack, confused. "Just my school stuff, and a basketball," he replied. The boy's voice was steady, polite. But Officer Hayes wasn't satisfied. He motioned for Jamal to set the bag down and step back. In that moment, neighbors began to peek through their blinds, curious about the scene unfolding on their quiet street. A jogger slowed down across the road, pretending not to notice. Jamal followed every instruction, his hands visible, his movements deliberate. And yet, the officer's tone grew sharper. His hand lingered near his holster. And then, it happened. Pepper spray. Without warning, without reason. A 16-year-old boy, blinded and gasping for air in the middle of his own neighborhood. The officer holstered the canister, his expression unmoved. But as Jamal stumbled back, choking on the acrid sting, he uttered a name that would change everything. "Call my dad, he's the chief." What should have been an ordinary day had already spiraled into chaos for Jamal. He crouched on the pavement, coughing and blinking against the searing pain in his eyes. Each breath was a struggle as the chemical burn spread across his face. The world had narrowed to the sound of his own gasps and the distant murmur of voices, neighbors watching from behind windows, unsure whether to step in or stay silent. The officer, still standing over him, seemed frozen for a moment. Jamal's words hung in the air. "Call my dad. He's the chief." At first, Officer Hayes didn't respond. He glanced down at the boy, then at the open backpack, where the basketball and a few crumpled papers lay scattered. There was nothing threatening in sight, but that didn't seem to matter. Hayes bent down, grabbing Jamal's arm to pull him upright. His grip was firm, too firm for someone half his size. "Let's go," he muttered, his tone dismissive. Jamal winced, stumbling as the officer led him toward the patrol car. His protests were quiet, almost pleading. "You don't understand, call my dad." But Hayes wasn't listening. He was already reaching for the radio clipped to his shoulder, ready to call in backup. Jamal's father, Police Chief Terrence Grant, was sitting at his desk when the call came through. He had just finished reviewing the morning reports and was looking forward to an uneventful day. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the line, routine at first, but then a detail caught his attention. Officer Hayes requesting backup on Maple Street. Teen male, resisting. For a moment, the chief froze. Maple Street. Teen male. His heart sank as he grabbed his phone and dialed Jamal's number. It rang, and rang, and rang. On the curb, Jamal was now handcuffed, his wrists digging into the hard plastic restraints. The officer had pressed him against the hood of the patrol car, his voice sharp and commanding. Neighbors stepped outside, their murmurs growing louder as they realized who the boy was. "That's the chief's son," someone whispered. But the officer didn't seem to hear, or maybe he didn't care. Jamal's pleas were drowned out by the static of the police radio and the growing hum of an approaching siren. And then, as the situation escalated, Jamal's father arrived. Chief Grant's unmarked car screeched to a stop in the middle of the street. He stepped out quickly, his badge visible on his chest, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. He took one look at his son, disheveled, cuffed and still gasping for air, and then turned to the officer. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Officer Hayes hesitated, his grip tightening on Jamal's arm as if to justify his actions. This kid was acting suspicious. "I asked him to comply, and he resisted." The chief's voice was firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Suspicious? Suspicious of what? Do you even know who he is?" Hayes blinked, his confidence faltering for the first time. "No, sir, but, he's my son," the chief interrupted, his tone deadly calm. "Let him go. Now." For a moment, it seemed like Hayes might argue. His hand hovered near his holster, his posture rigid. But the weight of the moment, of the neighbors watching, of the chief's unwavering gaze, was too much to ignore. Slowly, he reached down and unlocked the cuffs. Jamal stepped back, rubbing his wrists, his eyes still red and watery from the spray. The chief placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder, but his gaze never left Hayes. "We'll be discussing this later," he said, his voice low and controlled. The scene was tense, the air thick with unspoken words. The neighbors began to disperse, their quiet conversations trailing off as they returned to their homes. Hayes climbed back into his patrol car without another word, his expression a mix of frustration and embarrassment. For Jamal, the ordeal wasn't over. His father led him to the car, where a bottle of water and a towel waited in the back seat. As the chief helped him clean his face, his voice softened. "Are you okay?" he asked. Jamal nodded, but the look in his eyes said otherwise. By the time they returned home, word of the incident had already begun to spread. Calls flooded the chief's phone, colleagues, friends, even reporters. The day that had started so normally had turned into something far more complex. The questions were only just beginning. Why had Hayes acted the way he did? And what would the chief do next? One thing was clear, this was more than a misunderstanding. It was the beginning of a reckoning. For Chief Terrence Grant, the incident wasn't just personal, it was professional. As a father, he wanted answers for his son. But as the head of the Ridgewood Police Department, he faced a much larger issue: how could he hold his own officer accountable while maintaining the trust of his department? The questions came fast and hard, and the answers weren't easy. News of the incident spread quickly. Within hours, the story was circulating through text messages, social media, and whispered conversations around town. The details varied depending on who was telling it. Some described it as an unfortunate misunderstanding. Others called it what it was, an abuse of power fueled by racial bias. The truth, though, was undeniable. A boy had been pepper-sprayed without cause, and the man responsible was wearing a badge. By the next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with outrage. Parents who had watched their children grow up alongside Jamal were calling for justice. Church leaders organized meetings to discuss what had happened, and local activists began drafting statements demanding accountability. The tension in Ridgewood, a town known for its quiet streets and close-knit community, was impossible to ignore. For Chief Grant, the pressure was mounting. His phone rang constantly, reporters asking for statements, concerned citizens demanding answers, and, most troubling of all, city officials questioning his leadership. He had spent decades building his reputation as a fair and respected leader. Now, that reputation was on the line. Meanwhile, Officer Hayes was facing his own reckoning. Placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, he avoided the spotlight, but the whispers about his conduct were impossible to escape. His record, once considered unremarkable, was now under scrutiny. Complaints from years past, brushed aside at the time, resurfaced in the wake of Jamal's case. Patterns began to emerge. Patterns that painted a troubling picture. This wasn't just about Hayes, or even about Jamal. It was about something bigger. The residents of Ridgewood began asking questions they hadn't asked before. Was this an isolated incident, or a symptom of a larger problem within their police department? What did justice look like in a case like this? And who would be held accountable, not just for Jamal, but for every person who had experienced something similar? For Jamal, life didn't simply return to normal. The physical pain from the pepper spray faded, but the emotional scars remained. He couldn't step outside without reliving the moment. The sight of a patrol car made his heart race. Friends offered their support, but some avoided him, unsure of what to say. At school, the whispers followed him down every hallway. He felt like a symbol of something much larger than himself, a weight he never asked to carry. As the days passed, the official investigation began. Internal Affairs conducted interviews, reviewed body cam footage, and collected statements. The footage, once it was released, confirmed what Jamal had said all along: he had done nothing to provoke Hayes. The video showed a calm teenager following instructions and an officer whose actions escalated without cause. The footage sparked outrage far beyond Ridgewood. It was shared thousands of times online, with hashtags demanding justice for Jamal. The story became a rallying cry for activists across the country. People who had never heard of Ridgewood before now knew its name, and they weren't staying silent. For Chief Grant, the evidence was clear. Hayes had acted irresponsibly, and there had to be consequences. But taking action wasn't simple. The department was divided. Some officers defended Hayes, arguing that he had made a mistake in the heat of the moment. Others quietly admitted that they had seen this behavior from him before. The chief faced a choice: protect the integrity of his department or protect his own son. For him, the answer was clear. Integrity came first. Community leaders began to take action as well. Public meetings turned into protests. Residents marched through the streets of Ridgewood, holding signs and chanting for accountability. Local reporters covered every development, and national outlets soon followed. What had started as a single incident now felt like a moment of reckoning for the entire town. But even as the investigation moved forward, questions remained. Would Hayes face criminal charges, or simply lose his job? What changes, if any, would the department make to prevent this from happening again? And most importantly, would justice truly be served? The answers weren't just about Ridgewood, they were about every community grappling with the same issues. As the protests grew louder and the investigation drew closer to its conclusion, the stakes couldn't have been higher. For Jamal, for Chief Grant, and for Ridgewood itself, what happened next would define their future. And for everyone watching, it was a moment to ask, what does accountability really mean? For Chief Terrence Grant, accountability began with transparency. He had built his career on trust, and now, that trust was on the line. The investigation into Officer Hayes wasn't just about what happened to Jamal, it was about the culture of the Ridgewood Police Department and what it represented to the people it served. Internal Affairs began their work, sifting through reports, body cam footage, and testimony. The first step was to reconstruct the events of that morning in painstaking detail. Officer Hayes claimed he had acted out of caution, that Jamal's behavior had been suspicious. But the evidence told a different story. The footage showed a calm, compliant teenager, a backpack, and nothing that justified the use of force. Hayes's explanations quickly unraveled. As they dug deeper, investigators began to uncover troubling patterns. Complaints filed against Hayes over the years painted a picture of a man who frequently overstepped his bounds. Minor traffic stops that escalated unnecessarily. Encounters with young black men that ended with citations or searches far more often than with their white peers. These complaints had been dismissed at the time, buried under paperwork and bureaucratic red tape. But now, they couldn't be ignored. The investigation also turned inward, raising uncomfortable questions about the department itself. Ridgewood wasn't a large town, and its police force reflected that. It was a small team where everyone knew each other, where the lines between accountability and loyalty often blurred. Officers who had worked alongside Hayes for years were suddenly forced to confront their own complicity. Had they seen signs of bias? Had they spoken up, or stayed silent? Interviews with officers revealed a range of perspectives. Some defended Hayes, calling him a good cop who had made a mistake. Others admitted they had seen behavior from him that raised concerns, but they hadn't wanted to jeopardize their own careers by reporting it. For Chief Grant, these conversations were some of the hardest of his life. He wasn't just their leader, he was also a father fighting for his son. Balancing those roles was becoming increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, Jamal was called to give his own account of the events. Sitting across from investigators, he recounted every detail of that morning, the sound of the siren, the questions, the spray. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled as he spoke. He didn't want to be here, reliving it all. But he understood what was at stake. This wasn't just about him. It was about making sure no one else had to go through the same thing. As the investigation unfolded, the public's demands for justice grew louder. Protests in Ridgewood intensified, spilling into neighboring towns. Marches filled the streets, led by activists and community leaders. Signs reading "Justice for Jamal" and "End Police Brutality" were impossible to ignore. The pressure on the department, and on Chief Grant, was immense. For Grant, every decision felt like walking a tightrope. His officers looked to him for leadership, while his community looked to him for justice. He knew he couldn't fail either of them. Privately, he wrestled with his own emotions. Seeing his son struggle to move past the incident was a constant reminder of why this fight mattered. But as a professional, he couldn't let those emotions cloud his judgment. The integrity of the investigation had to come first. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about one officer. It was about a system that allowed officers like Hayes to operate unchecked. Training records showed gaps in bias awareness programs. Complaint logs revealed a pattern of dismissing or minimizing civilian concerns. Ridgewood wasn't unique in this, these were issues facing police departments across the country. But now, they were Ridgewood's issues to address. The turning point came when the body cam footage was made public. It was a decision Chief Grant had agonized over, knowing it would bring more scrutiny to his department but also knowing it was the right thing to do. The footage left little room for interpretation. The public could see Jamal, calm and cooperative, doing everything he was asked. And they could see Hayes, escalating without cause, reaching for the pepper spray without hesitation. The reaction was immediate. Outrage poured in from all corners of the community. Calls for Hayes's termination turned into demands for criminal charges. For many, the footage confirmed what they had long suspected, that racial bias wasn't just a distant issue, it was happening in their own town. For others, it was a wake-up call, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths they had ignored for too long. With the evidence mounting, the investigation reached its final stages. Internal Affairs compiled their findings into a report that left no doubt about what had happened. Hayes had acted recklessly, violating department protocols and abusing his authority. The question now was what consequences he would face, and whether those consequences would satisfy a community demanding real change. By the time the investigation concluded, the tension in Ridgewood was palpable. Everyone, from the protesters in the streets to the officers inside the station, was waiting for the chief's decision. What happened next would set the tone not just for the department, but for the entire community. For Chief Grant, the stakes couldn't have been higher. He wasn't just deciding Hayes's fate, he was deciding what kind of leader he wanted to be, and what kind of legacy he would leave behind. For Chief Grant, the weight of that responsibility was immense. As the findings of the investigation were finalized, the truth became undeniable: this wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't just one bad officer. It was a system that had allowed behaviors like Hayes's to persist unchecked. And now, that system was on the verge of unraveling. The report compiled by Internal Affairs was exhaustive. Pages upon pages documented Hayes's actions that morning, detailing every misstep, every violation of protocol. But the report didn't stop there. It also exposed a history of complaints against Hayes, complaints that had been ignored, dismissed, or quietly filed away. And Hayes wasn't alone. Similar patterns emerged with other officers, painting a picture of a department that had grown complacent about accountability. When the findings were presented to Chief Grant, they came with a warning: releasing this information to the public would spark a firestorm. It would call the entire department into question, shaking the trust that Grant had spent years building. But the chief knew there was no other choice. Transparency was the only path forward, no matter how difficult it might be. The revelations began with a press conference. Chief Grant stood at the podium, flanked by community leaders and department representatives. His voice was steady as he addressed the gathered crowd. The actions of Officer Hayes were unacceptable, he began. But we cannot stop at holding one individual accountable. We must confront the systemic issues that allowed this to happen in the first place. The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. And then, he took it a step further. He announced a full overhaul of the department's complaint review process and mandatory training on racial bias for all officers. The response was immediate. For some, Grant's transparency was a sign of true leadership. For others, it wasn't enough. Protesters outside City Hall carried signs demanding Hayes face criminal charges, not just administrative discipline. Social media exploded with debates about whether the reforms would be enough to create meaningful change. But amidst the noise, one thing was clear: Grant's decisions had set a precedent that would be hard to ignore. Meanwhile, Hayes's career was effectively over. The findings of the investigation had left no room for doubt: he had violated department policies and failed to uphold the standards of his badge. Hayes submitted his resignation under pressure, but for many, that wasn't enough. The community called for him to be held criminally responsible for his actions that morning. The district attorney's office began to review the case, weighing whether to file charges. For Jamal and his family, the revelations were bittersweet. The acknowledgement of Hayes's wrongdoing was a step forward, but it didn't erase the pain of what had happened. Jamal's mother, a quiet but steady presence throughout the ordeal, spoke at a community meeting, her voice breaking as she described the impact on her son. "He doesn't sleep the same. He doesn't smile the same. No child should have to carry this kind of burden." Her words resonated deeply, cutting through the noise of the broader debate. But the report revealed more than just Hayes's actions. It brought to light a culture within the department that had allowed these behaviors to persist. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and unprofessional conduct weren't new, they had simply been ignored. Grant's decision to release this information was a turning point. It forced the community to confront uncomfortable truths, but it also sparked something else: hope for real change. Community leaders seized the moment, organizing forums and workshops to address the underlying issues exposed by the investigation. Local activists began working with the department to develop new policies, ensuring civilian oversight of police complaints. Churches, schools, and local businesses joined the conversation, recognizing that true accountability required a collective effort. For Chief Grant, the revelations marked the most challenging period of his career. He faced criticism from within his own department, where some officers felt betrayed by his decision to release the report. But he also gained the respect of a community that had long felt ignored. Grant's actions didn't just define his leadership, they redefined what leadership could look like in a moment of crisis. And for Jamal, the revelations brought a mix of emotions. He was glad that the truth was out, that people were finally listening. But he also struggled with the newfound attention. At school, he became something of a symbol, a constant reminder of what had happened. He told his father one evening, "I didn't ask to be part of this." His father nodded, understanding the weight his son carried. "I know," Grant said. "But you're helping make things better. That matters." As the dust began to settle, one thing became clear: the revelations had changed Ridgewood forever. The community was no longer content to accept the status quo. The police department could no longer operate as it had before. And for the Grant family, the fight for justice was far from over. What had started as a single incident had grown into a movement, one that would leave a lasting impact on everyone involved. The question now was simple: what came next? Ridgewood had reached a crossroads. The investigation was over, the findings were public, and Officer Hayes was gone. But the scars left by his actions, and the systemic issues they exposed, remained. For Chief Grant, for Jamal, and for the community, the journey wasn't over. It was only beginning. The decision to prosecute Officer Hayes rested with the district attorney. After weeks of deliberation, charges were filed: misdemeanor assault and misconduct in office. For the community, the announcement was met with mixed emotions. Some saw it as a victory, a sign that even those in positions of power could be held accountable. Others felt the charges were too lenient, falling short of the justice they believed Jamal deserved. The trial was brief but highly publicized. Hayes's defense argued that his actions, while misguided, were not criminal. They pointed to his years of service, claiming he had made a split-second decision under pressure. The prosecution countered with the body cam footage, playing it frame by frame for the jury. The images were damning. Jamal's calm compliance. Hayes's unwarranted escalation. The pepper spray canister raised and fired without cause. In the end, the jury found Hayes guilty of misconduct but acquitted him on the assault charge. He was sentenced to probation, barred from working in law enforcement again. For Jamal and his family, the verdict was bittersweet. It wasn't the full measure of justice they had hoped for, but it was something. A step toward accountability, however small. Within the Ridgewood Police Department, the fallout continued. Chief Grant's reforms went into effect immediately. A civilian oversight board was established, tasked with reviewing complaints and ensuring transparency. Bias training became mandatory for every officer, with an emphasis on de-escalation techniques and community engagement. These changes didn't happen without resistance. Some officers bristled at the new policies, arguing they created unnecessary scrutiny. But for Grant, there was no turning back. "If we want to rebuild trust," he told his officers, "we have to earn it." In the community, the conversation evolved. Churches and schools hosted dialogues about race and policing, creating spaces for residents to share their experiences and fears. Activists continued their work, holding the department accountable and pushing for broader reforms. The protests that had filled the streets of Ridgewood became less frequent, but the energy behind them remained. People were no longer content to stay silent. For Jamal, life slowly began to move forward. Therapy sessions helped him process the trauma, though the memories of that morning lingered. He poured his energy into basketball, using the court as a refuge. He also found his voice, speaking at community events and sharing his story with students in local schools. "What happened to me isn't just my story," he told one group. "It's about all of us." About what we're willing to accept, and what we're not. The Grant family grew closer in the aftermath of the ordeal. Dinners became a time for reflection, a chance to talk about what they had learned and how they could move forward. Jamal's father often struggled with guilt, feeling as though his dual roles as father and chief had been at odds. But Jamal reassured him. "You did what you had to do, Dad," he said one night. "You stood up for me, and for everyone else." The incident in Ridgewood sparked conversations far beyond the town itself. Other police departments began to review their own policies, spurred by the attention the case had received. Advocacy groups used Jamal's story as an example of why reform was needed, citing it in campaigns and legislative hearings. What had started as a single moment of injustice had become a catalyst for change, a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. In the years that followed, Ridgewood slowly began to heal. The changes within the police department, while not perfect, marked a shift in how the community and law enforcement worked together. Trust, once shattered, began to rebuild, one small step at a time. Jamal's name became synonymous with resilience, his story a reminder that even in the face of injustice, change was possible. The morning that started with a walk home from basketball practice had turned into something no one in Ridgewood would ever forget. It exposed painful truths, but it also sparked something greater, a chance to be better. For Chief Grant, for Jamal, and for the community, the road ahead was still long. But they had taken the first steps. And sometimes, that's where real change begins. Jamal's story is just one of many, but it's a story that matters. If you believe in the importance of accountability, in the need for justice, and in the power of change, share this story. Let it spark conversations in your own community. Together, we can make a difference.